Coming in at number 10 is Ambrose Bierce. A famous journalist and short story writer during the turn of the century, Ambrose was best known for his novel The Devil's Dictionary, after it was named one of the 100 greatest masterpieces of American literature. However, that would not be his only claim to fame. At the start of the American Civil War, Ambrose enlisted in the Union Army and fought in countless battles, once even garnering great respect in the local newspapers for his daring rescue under fire of a gravely wounded comrade at the Battle of Rich Mountain. By 1863, Ambrose was promoted to first lieutenant and went on to have a valiant military career. So when he disappeared from the public eye in 1913, everyone was completely in shock. Apparently in October he was on some kind of tour of his Civil War battlefields, then by December he crossed over into the Mexico border, met Pancho Villa, the leader of the Mexican Revolution, and asked to join his army as an observer. But after his crossover, he was barely heard from. His last known contact was a letter he sent to a close friend stating that the next day he was leaving for an unknown destination. And from there, he vanished without a trace. No body was ever recovered, and he became one of the most famous disappearances in American history. Coming in at number 9 is Jim Thompson. In the late 1960s, Jim became a popular figure after nearly single-handedly saving Thailand's silk industry from extinction. And while his mainstream fame came from his commercial endeavors, he also had an interesting past that some believe may or may not have had to do with his strange and inexplicable disappearance. As it turns out, before he moved to Asia and became a wealthy socialite, he was an operative with the OSS during the Second World War, and not only that, it was also rumored that he may have even been a spy at one time or another. Right before he vanished, Jim was reported to be leaving on a motorcycle for Malaysia. Then on Sunday, March 26, 1967, he disappeared from Cameron Highlands and generated one of the largest land searches in Southeast Asian history to date. Sadly, the mogul was never tracked down, leaving some to believe he could have been taken out by the CIA or competing businessmen. Those are merely rumors, as no evidence can back up what really happened to him. All we know is that he was never seen again. Coming in at number 8 is John Anglin. In 1958, John and his brother Clarence robbed the Columbia Savings Bank building, landing the pair with a 35-year sentence for the crime. At first, they hopped around a few different prisons, but after a series of attempted escapes, they were transferred to Alcatraz, John arriving in 1960 and his brother in 1961. Once they arrived, they were pleased to see an old friend, Frank Morris, and after Clarence's arrival in 1961, under the wing of Morris, 3 of them and another inmate began planning their great escape from the island prison. Over the next 6 months, they began secretly widening the ventilation ducts until they were large enough to pass through, constructing makeshift life preservers out of stolen raincoats, and a life raft that was stitched by hand and sealed using liquid plastic. On the night of the escape in 1962, leaving behind look-alike papier-mâché masks in their beds to keep guards off of their scent, 3 of the 4 men climbed through the vents to their freedom. But by the time prison officials realized they were not in their cells, the men were long gone. For many years, it was kind of assumed they had drowned, as they were not incredibly well equipped for the rough waters. That was until 2013, when new evidence pointed towards their survival. Apparently, the San Francisco police had been sent a letter claiming to be from one of the escapees, John Anglin, saying that they had all escaped that night in 1962, and that he was now an 83-year-old man suffering cancer. The purpose of the letter, as was detailed, was in hope to negotiate his surrender in exchange for medical treatment, but no one was ever able to track him down after that. Coming in at number 7 is Natalee Holloway. While Natalee Holloway may not have been a famous actor or singer prior to her disappearance, her case sparked international headlines, turning her into a tragic overnight celebrity. On May 30th, 2005, after a trip to Aruba with her graduating class, Natalee was meant to fly back home to the United States, but Natalee never even arrived for her flight. The last time she was seen was the night prior outside a restaurant with 3 local men who all claimed that they dropped her off at the hotel and had no clue what had happened to her. And when authorities went to go check the room, they found her packed luggage and a passport inside, but no sight of the missing girl. Things took a turn when one of the young men who was last seen with her attempted to extort her family out of $250,000 in 2010. His name was Joran Andreas Vandersloot, and he claimed to have killed the young woman and hidden in her body, but would only reveal the location after he was paid. The FBI was notified of the bribe and went along with it, sending over the wire transfer, but as it turns out, his claim was entirely false and was merely a ruse to get some money. Sadly, in the 17 years since she disappeared, Natalie has never been seen, nor have any remains been found. Coming in at number 6 is Frederick Valentich. On the evening of Saturday, October 21st, 1978, Australian pilot Frederick Valentich informed the Melbourne Air Traffic Control that he was being accompanied by an aircraft about 1,000 feet above him. So imagine Frederick's shock when the Air Traffic Control replied to him saying that there was no known traffic at that level. Now, a little backstory. Frederick was a fairly new pilot who had twice applied to be in the Royal Australian Air Force, but was rejected on the basis of inadequate qualifications. However, this story doesn't end with a mysterious crash that one could assume resulted in a death. It's much more mysterious than that. After learning that there was not supposed to be anything above him, Frederick went on to describe what he was seeing, saying that it was a large, unknown aircraft that appeared to be illuminated by 4 bright landing lights. Starting to sound suspicious? Then he reported that the aircraft was approaching him from the east and orbiting above him. When asked to identify the aircraft, Frederick was not able to, only further describing its looks, this time mentioning it had a shiny metal surface and a green light on it. For the last time, the air traffic control radioed over asking to please identify the aircraft, to which he famously replied, "It's not an aircraft." His transmission was then interrupted by an unidentified noise described as metallic scraping sounds before all was lost. To this day, neither Frederick or his aircraft have been found, and many conspiracy theories believe that he was abducted by aliens. Coming in at number 5 is Virginia Dare and the Roanoke Colony. One of the most famous disappearances of all time wasn't just one person, but in fact an entire colony of people. Back in 1587, during the time that Europeans were heading to the New World to start a new life, a group of 100 settlers found the small island of Roanoke, now modern-day Dare County in North Carolina, and decided to make it their new home. Shortly after the group settled, it was determined that the man John White would be the leader of the group, likely due to the fact that his wife had just given birth to their daughter, Virginia Dare, making her the first ever English-born child in the New World. However, after some time in the colony, John headed back to England in search of more supplies for his town. What was meant to be a short visit accidentally turned into a 3-year stay due to the Anglo-Spanish War. However, once he was permitted to return, he made his way back to America only to find that his entire colony had vanished out of thin air. He looked around for clues for where they could have gone, but there was no sign of battle and no graves reported in the area, seemingly pointing towards the idea that they had moved to a new location. All John found was the word Croatoan carved into a single wooden post, and to this day the disappearance of the Roanoke colony remains a giant mystery. Coming in at number 4, Louis Le Prince. French inventor and the famed pioneer of the motion picture camera, Louis Le Prince is widely credited as being the father of cinematography. In September of 1890, on the cusp of international fame, Le Prince was looking forward to a planned tour to showcase his new invention across the United States. However, prior to his journey across the pond, Le Prince organized to visit his brother in Dijon. Then on September 16th, he was supposed to take a train to Paris with some friends, but got caught up, missed his friends, and ended up taking a later train. But strangely, he was never seen again. Of course, when the inventor didn't show up for his showcase, an investigation ensued, but despite exhaustive searches from French police and the Scotland Yard, neither him nor his body was ever found. There are quite a few conspiracy theories surrounding his mysterious disappearance, one being that he was assassinated due to his competing patent with Edison, while others think he could have taken his own life or been trying to escape financial problems. However, as he's never been found, we will never truly know what happened to him on the train that fateful day. Coming in at number 3, Roald Amundsen. The year was 1928 when celebrity explorer Roald Amundsen vanished into thin air and was never to be seen again. Roald had become a world-famous face after his 1911 expedition where he successfully reached the South Pole, and from that point forward, he was considered one of the greatest explorers to have ever lived. So imagine everyone's surprise when he went missing on a trip far less dangerous than any of his previous missions. The day was June 18th, 1928, and believe it or not, it was not even his own mission he disappeared on, but a rescue trip for an already missing person. Along with a crew of 5, Roald boarded the rescue flight and headed for the crew that had crashed while returning from the North Pole. But neither Roald, his crew, or his aircraft were ever seen again. Due to his popularity, a search for the team began nearly immediately, but after no evidence of a crash and no bodies were found, it was called off in September. Years later, in 2004 and 2009, the Norwegian Navy attempted to search for wreckage of the mysterious disappearing aircraft, but they too never uncovered a single piece of evidence, and whatever happened to Roald Amundsen remains a mystery to this day. Coming in at number 2, Raoul Wallenberg. A Swedish architect, businessman, diplomat, and humanitarian, Raoul's main reason for celebrity is due to his special operation in World War II to rescue Jews from German-occupied Hungary, saving them from being sent away to death camps. In 1944, while serving as Sweden's special envoy for Budapest, Raoul provided special protective passports to nearly 15,000 Jews, identifying the vulnerable residents as Swedish, thus deterring the fascists from deporting them. From there, he set up the newly Swedish residents in safe houses advertised as libraries or institutes in an attempt to keep the real truth hidden and their real identities safe. Then, in January of 1945, Wallenberg was called to General Malinovsky's headquarters to answer allegations that he was engaged in espionage. His last recorded words were, "I'm going to Malinovsky's, whether as a guest or prisoner, I do not know yet." From the day he left, his exact whereabouts have never been determined, and the truth behind his disappearance has had many theories. You see, despite the Soviets declaring in 1957 that he had died 10 years prior, suddenly in the night, there are many that dispute his death. Several former inmates of the same prison have come forward stating that they saw Raoul after the Soviets had declared him legally dead, the last witness claiming to have seen him in 1987. While we don't know for sure exactly what happened to Raoul, as there has not been any physical evidence to prove his death, authorities have continued investigating the case as recently as 2012, hoping to finally track down this wartime hero. And last up today in our number 1 spot is Emanuela Orlandi. The daughter of a prominent Vatican employee, it was not only the Vatican that was devastated when 15-year-old Emanuela disappeared from the Holy See in 1983, but the entirety of Rome as well. On the last day she was seen, Emanuela had apparently called her sister after her music class to let her know why she wasn't home yet. A rep from Avon Cosmetics had offered her a job. At the end of the class, Orlandi then spoke of the job offer with another female friend who left her at a bus stop in the company of another girl. However, reports state that the last time she was seen was getting into a large black BMW. The next morning, still missing, her parents were incredibly worried, so they called the music teacher as well as the police, and she was officially declared a missing person that day. But sadly, they were not able to track down the young woman. Over the next few weeks, the parents received a series of distressing phone calls from people claiming to have their daughter, but authorities were never able to track down or determine who was making these calls or from where. It has been suggested that a Rome-based syndicate kidnapped her to force the Vatican to pay them back an outstanding loan, while other theories suggest something even darker: an inside job by the Vatican police. Sadly, the truth of the girl's whereabouts remains as big a mystery today as it was 39 years ago, but still the case remains open, and Pope Francis is determined to finally put an end to the family's suffering. Starting us off at number 10 is Scott Smith. Back in the 80s, one of the biggest bands was Canadian rock group Loverboy. I mean, Working for the Weekend is still played on radio stations today. So when one of the founding members, Scott Smith, seemingly vanished from reality, there were lots of questions. Back in November of 2000, after playing with his band in Vancouver at a benefit, Smith, along with 2 other friends and his girlfriend, set sail for Mexico on a 37-foot sailboat. As they were sailing down the coast, nearing San Francisco, the weather started to get rough and the waves started to get dangerous. Then one large wave, roughly 20 feet in size, knocked over Smith and sent him shooting off the deck of the vessel into the water. His friends on the boat were not hit, but were in shock about what they had just seen. They searched for the man overboard pole, but it had been taken by the waves along with their friend. Within 20 minutes, the Coast Guard helicopters arrived and dispatched 2 search boats that scoured for hundreds of miles to no avail. Still, his family were bound and determined to find him, so they even paid for a private search. Unfortunately, that too was fruitless. To this day, Smith's remains have never been uncovered, and no one knows if he truly did lose his life to the sea. Coming in at number 9, Daniel Lynn Lagerlof. While for North Americans he might not be the most well-known on the list, once upon a time he was one of the most acclaimed directors and writers in Sweden. But his rise to stardom all came to a crashing halt in 2011 when Daniel was out scouting locations for a new thriller project and disappeared forever. Last anyone knew, Daniel had gone to the beautiful nature reserve of Chirpanan, a remote island, all by himself. Now, why he went all by himself, no one knows, but according to his friends, he was simply going off to explore the island and planned to return. Tragically, he never did. To this day, his whereabouts are still a mystery, as no remains have ever been found, and no one knows what actually happened to him. There is one theory that he slipped and fell into the water, but again, no body has been found. Tragically, he has a wife and family, all of whom are hoping that he will still be found, but to this day, no investigations have proved successful. Next up at number 8 is Harold Holt. Nearly 2 years into his term as Australia's 17th Prime Minister, Harold Holt vanished into thin air. Back in December of 1967, Holt, who had always been an avid lover of the ocean, decided to set out for a little trip across with 4 other companions. However, on the way back to Portsea, Holt insisted that the group stop by a small remote beach for a quick swim after lunch. Holt, who was a strong swimmer, said that he knew the waters like the back of his hand and that he had done it many times before. But still, the weather was rough that day, and so only one of friends agreed to take the dip with him. His friend stayed close to shore, but Holt took a different approach and decided to venture out further, but seemingly got caught up in a wave and in the blink of an eye was gone. To this day, his body has never been found, although a 2005 investigation concluded that he could have drowned. This investigation, however, didn't stop many from theorizing that the leader had faked his own death or that he was some sort of secret CIA agent. While it does sound a little ridiculous at first, he's never been found, so I mean, the truth is still up for debate. Coming in at number 7 is Jim Sullivan. He might not have been the biggest name in his time, but Jim Sullivan definitely had a cult following back in the 60s and 70s, which made his disappearance all the more mysterious. In March of 1975, Sullivan was heading out to Nashville for what he hoped was gonna be his big break into the industry. But for whatever reason, Sullivan never made it to Tennessee. Instead, his car was found abandoned in the desert in New Mexico, and his wallet, clothes, and guitar were all found left in a nearby motel. And as for Sullivan, he was gone without a trace. Now, I don't know many musicians that would go anywhere for long periods of time without their guitar, a sentiment that every single one of Sullivan's friends and bandmates echoed. All of them explained that had he planned to vanish, that would have been the one thing he would take with him. But here is where it gets a little extra strange. Sullivan's most well-known album was called UFO, and on the record were songs seemingly telling the story about driving into the desert and being abducted by aliens. And while of course there is no evidence to prove that that really happened, his body has never been found, and there's no evidence to prove it didn't either. I mean, honestly, who knows? Next up at number 6 is Bison Dele. Once a firecracker player for the NBA, at the age of 30, Bison, who had changed his name from Brian Williams, unexpectedly retired from the game and ran away to live a carefree, adventure-filled lifestyle in Lebanon and across the Mediterranean. From there, he moved on to Australia, where he began learning how to sail, and he bought a boat and named it Hakuna Matata. Then in July of 2002, he decided that he was going to set sail from Tahiti to Hawaii, and he invited his girlfriend as well as his older brother Miles Dabbard along on the trip with him. However, Bison never made it to Hawaii, and neither did his girlfriend or the captain of the boat. The only person who was ever seen again was his brother Miles, who returned to Tahiti alone on the boat a few weeks later on July 20th. Then, 2 months after their mysterious disappearance at sea, Miles was arrested in Phoenix trying to buy gold with one of his brother's checks, and was found using his brother's passport. Even more suspicious is that just 2 days prior, authorities had found the Hakuna Matata with its license plate removed, covered in what seemed to be patched up bullet holes, and registered under a different name. Many believed Miles was very jealous of his brother's success and money, and so him as well as the other 2 on the boat and threw their bodies into the ocean. But no bodies have ever been recovered, so it's never been able to be proven. Plus, the only person who could have given a first-hand account of what went down, Miles himself, overdosed on insulin and died in September of 2002, leaving the entire ordeal as one big mess. Coming in at number 5, Richie Edwards. A big name in the late 80s and 90s, Richie Edwards was a moody and talented musician with a passion for angsty lyrics and a habit of extremely disturbing publicity stunts. For example, once a journalist alluded to the fact that he and his band were posers and not sincere punk rockers, and so Edward grabbed a razor and carved "for real" into his arm. During his rise to fame, Edwards was very candid about his struggles with mental health and self-harm and routinely romanticized the perfect disappearance, but still no one actually ever thought he would try to plot his own. Although no one knows the truth behind his 1995 disappearance, there are definitely some strange facts surrounding it. Firstly, he had been due to fly from Wales to the US for a promotional tour for his new album, The Holy Bible. But 2 weeks prior to his disappearance, it was discovered he withdrew £200 from his account every day. Then, the night before he vanished, he left a gift addressed to his on-again, off-again girlfriend with a note saying, "I love you." Lastly, the morning of his flight, he checked out of his hotel at 7 AM, leaving behind his suitcase, and his car was later found near the Severn Bridge that connects England and Wales. He was never seen again. At first, it was suspected he could have taken his own life since they found his car by a bridge, but no body was ever found and no trace of Edwards was ever recovered. Next up at number 4 is Michael Rockefeller. Son of the famous and incredibly wealthy New York governor, in 1961, Michael decided to venture out to the remote Otjanep village of the Asmat people in South Papua, Indonesia. The purpose of his trip was to collect primitive art around New Guinea, hoping to curate enough to bring back a collection to his family's museum in New York. However, in November of 1961, while sailing about 3 miles from the shore in his double pontoon boat along with his residential anthropologist he'd brought along on the journey, it suddenly capsized, leaving Michael and his friend with no other choice but to attempt to swim to shore. During his likely unwelcome visit to the remote area, Michael believed he had made friends with several of the local tribes, and it's said that Michael called out to them for help, but no one really knows what exactly happened to him, as he was never seen again. Some say he never made it to shore and drowned trying to get to land, while one author, Carl Hoffman, revisited the exact location where Michael traveled all those years ago, and according to the locals he spoke with, they said, quote, "On the shore, he saw familiar faces, those of the Otjanep warriors. Instead of the rescue Rockefeller hoped for, he was stabbed in the ribs by one of the men, fatally in the precise actions of ritualistic headhunting and consumed by the warriors." However, as there is no proof of his death and no remains have ever been found, the truth is still up for debate. Coming in at number 3 is Lord Lucan. Unlike the others on this list, Lord Lucan, also known as John Bingham, was not really a victim of his circumstances, but rather a kind of evil guy that seemed to manage disappearing from the public eye forever. It all started back in 1974 when he bludgeoned his wife Veronica to death in her London home after she divorced him and won custody of the kids. Or at least that is who he thought he. After the deed had been done, Lucan was shocked to discover it was their nanny who lay dead on his floor. His wife, who was home at the time, called down for the nanny, and after not hearing a reply, went to the kitchen only to be attacked by a man she quickly figured out was her husband. She fought him off, managing to get him to stop after allegedly saying she would help him escape. That night, Lord Lucan called his mother asking her to pick up the children as there had been a terrible catastrophe and someone had attacked Veronica. Where he made this call from is is unknown, but from there he drove to a friend's house, and that was the last time there was a confirmed sighting. There's a few different theories around what happened to Lucan, one being that he took his own life in New Haven Harbor, while others believe he went into hiding somewhere in Africa. The strangest theory, however, is that his friends convinced him to take his own life and then fed his remains to tigers at a private zoo in Kent. However, in reality, no one knows what happened to the man, and his body has never been found. Next up at number 2, Jody Husentreat. Somewhat of a local celebrity in Iowa, Jody became well known thanks to her time as a news anchor. However, sadly in 1995, Jody disappeared and has never been found. At about 4 a.m. on June 27, 1995, Jody's producer realized she was not in for her morning broadcast. This was not like Jody, and so her producer called her to check up on her. When she got the call, Jody profusely apologized, saying she had slept through her alarm and was on her way over. But 2 hours went by and Jody had still not turned up. So her producer filled in for her in the morning show and then promptly contacted authorities at 7 a.m. When officers arrived at her apartment, they found her car as well as evidence that suggested a struggle near the car. Even worse was that they discovered an unidentified handprint on the car, but tragically, no more evidence of this case ever surfaced. Believed to have been abducted, no one knows where Jody could be or if she's alive, but her case remains an active investigation. Last up in our number 1 spot is Jean Spangler. Back in the 1940s, while on the rise of Hollywood stardom, young actress Jean Spangler suddenly disappeared, not only from the spotlight, but seemingly from existence altogether. On October 7th, 1949, Jean left her home in LA around 5 p.m., leaving her daughter with her sister-in-law and telling her she was heading to her ex-husband's house to discuss a late child support payment before she headed to work to film a night shoot. 2 hours later, she called the house saying that the shoot was going to take the full 8 hours and not to expect her home that evening. The next morning, Sophia, her sister-in-law, woke up and upon discovering that Jean was still not home from work, grew worried and filed a missing persons report. Once the investigation began, it was discovered that despite telling her family she was working the whole night, she was never at the studio filming the night of her disappearance. Even more peculiar is that a woman at a local farmer's market claimed to have spotted Jean browsing around 6 p.m. looking like she was waiting for someone. 2 days later, police found her purse with a strange note inside that read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while mother is away." Neither the mysterious Kirk or Dr. Scott were able to be found, and no one in Jean's family knew who she was speaking of. However, there was speculation that Kirk could have been Hollywood star Kirk Douglas. Still, despite a nationwide search, no further evidence on the case has ever been brought forward, but it remains open and she remains a missing person to this day.
Coming in at number 10, Alexis Sharkey. Alexis Sharkey was an Instagram influencer and Monat mentor who moved to Houston, Texas in January of 2020. In November of last year, after a trip to Mexico, friends and family began to get worried when they hadn't heard from her. Alexis was officially reported missing on November 27th, and the last time she was seen was when she left her house after having an argument with her husband. Of course, people were searching and trying to figure out where Alexis was, but no one was able to locate her. Shortly after this, an employee from the city of Houston was driving and saw some feet sticking out of the bush. This worker, of course, called the authorities, and when they arrived on the scene, they were able to confirm that they had sadly found Alexis, but she had passed away. Since this discovery, there has been, of course, plenty of speculation around what may have happened. Authorities have been able to confirm her cause of death, and the case has gone from a missing person case to an investigation and to search for the person who took Alexis's life. Many speculate her husband, but there hasn't been any proof of that to release to the public. Hopefully soon we will have the answers as to what really happened to Alexis, so the family can receive the closure they deserve.
In our number 9 spot today, we have Ready Set Glamour. Ready Set Glamour was a beauty guru and YouTuber who totally disappeared from social media a few years ago. Her fans were already wondering where she went and what had happened to her, but when the entire channel closed, it only made people more worried. You guys know how these things go, and of course her fans began swirling rumors of what happened and where she went. I don't have any concrete answers, but there are 2 main theories. The first is that she felt as though she needed to take time off because she was apparently pregnant. This is of course totally reasonable that she would want to focus on her growing family and maybe what was supposed supposed to be a break just naturally turned into a decision to leave the spotlight entirely. The other theory is that she may have been going through a divorce at the time and needed to focus on herself. This is of course another perfectly reasonable explanation that we can definitely all understand, especially if she was also pregnant at the time. I wish I had a solid answer for you guys, but I also totally respect her privacy. Wherever she is, I hope she is doing well and that she is happy. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out.
A person was a YouTuber who posted just a bunch of everyday videos that were kind of vlog style, many of which featured his very cute dog or other members of his family. His frequent uploads became quite a bit less frequent before he stopped posting altogether in late 2016. Because of the fact that there weren't any other social media linked to his account, his disappearance from the platform left a lot of people wondering what could have happened to him, as there were limited resources to figure that out. Some people speculated that he may have just decided he didn't want to make videos anymore, but some were worried something worse had happened, especially since one of his last videos was about how he thought a ghost was following him. Unfortunately, I don't have a concrete answer for what exactly happened, but the good news is that I am pretty sure I know where he went. It seems as though the YouTuber Matt Ophelia is a person. This is kind of weird considering the account of Matt Ophelia was made long before a person, but the two people on both accounts look very similar, which leads me to believe that this is the same person.
In our number 7 spot today, we have I Will Bot. I Will Bot was a YouTube account that featured the pianist Will Ting, and I know everyone's gonna be like, she said penis. And it basically just consisted of a ton of piano videos and covers. Will was well loved by his fans and subscribers, so they were rightfully all a little sad when his uploads became less frequent before they just stopped altogether in 2015. The good news for a while was that he continued to post on his Instagram, but even that account hasn't seen a post since 2018, so where could he have gone? I unfortunately am not really sure what exactly happened or where he went, but there is a lot of speculation. I think the most common theory, and the one that I'm hoping for, is that his regular life just got too busy to continue his social media presence, or perhaps he just lost his passion for creating content. Whatever really happened, wherever Will is, I hope that he is doing well.
Next up at number 6, we have Jessica Stein. Jessica Stein is an Instagram model from Australia who has left fans extremely worried. Jessica, who goes by the Instagram name Tula Vintage, stopped uploading after she posted it in January of 2020. Her final post, which came over a year ago, was to do with the Australian fires, which, as we now know, were just the beginning of an extremely tumultuous year globally. Jessica was known for her photos of her traveling the world in beautiful designer clothes, and she was one of the first influencers who made her living solely from sponsored posting, so it was of course very strange when she stopped posting altogether. Still, in March of 2021, we haven't had an update from her or anyone in the family, which has left many people guessing. Jessica has a beautiful young daughter named Rumi who suffers from an extremely rare chromosome disorder. Apparently, it's so rare that only 10 living people have ever been diagnosed with it, because it usually causes a miscarriage before the baby can be born. Many people believe that Rumi and her health struggles might be the reason Jessica is off social media. It is entirely possible that maybe she just needed more time to focus on her daughter, and I think that is something we can all understand and appreciate. I hope one day Jessica gives us all an update so we can hear how both her and Rumi are doing, and I truly am wishing them all the best.
In our number 5 spot today, we have Wang Zion Zheng. Wang was an influencer, environmentalist, and explorer who was dubbed as the Tibetan Adventurer, but he was also well known as Glacier Bro. Wang first got into his travels after seeing a tourism video for a snow-capped mountain, and since then he visited tons and tons of glaciers where he took videos and photos, which he of course posted on his social media accounts so everyone could come on his journeys with him. Wang even spoke at the UN Climate Change Conference a few years ago when he detailed his first-hand accounts of the quickly melting glaciers. On December 20th of 2020, Wang was exploring a glacial waterfall when he disappeared. Unfortunately, it seemed as though he must have fallen into the rushing icy water, where he most likely got trapped under a sheet of ice on the surface of the water. Wang was pretty quickly presumed dead because of the nature of his disappearance, but of course authorities and family and friends continued to search in hopes of some sort of closure. On March 18th, just a few days ago from the time we are filming this video, authorities ended up finding a body that they believe belongs to Wang. They have not yet confirmed the identity, but it is sadly most likely him. After Wang's disappearance, his brother posted on his social media accounts saying, "My brother lies forever in his favorite waterfall. For all of his life he was obsessed with glaciers and gave his life to the glaciers. This is the best resting place for him."
Alright, coming in at number 4, we have Nikki Donnelly. Nikki Donnelly was a woman from Toronto who was known for documenting her travels experiences on Instagram. Earlier this year, Nikki was hiking a mountain trail just north of Vancouver when she went missing. Nikki was known to go on these adventures by herself, so it wasn't unusual that she was alone when she disappeared. Before going missing, she had posted about reaching the summit of the mountain but was on her way back down where things went awry. Nikki actually called a friend to explain that she was lost as she had strayed from the trail on her way down. This friend quickly contacted a search and rescue team, but Nikki's call came at 3:20 p.m. which meant that nightfall was quickly approaching, and this happened in the winter, so of course with nighttime comes some bitterly cold Canadian weather and a lot of snow, which made the rescue team's night vision equipment less than efficient. Despite the rescue team's best efforts, Nikki wasn't found until the next morning, and by that time she had unfortunately passed away. Nikki is remembered as a very bright spirit and someone who was welcoming and warm to every person she encountered.
In our number 3 spot today, we have Lim Ji-hyun. Lim was a North Korean soldier who risked her life to escape her country and live a free life. This was in 2014, and she was 23 at the time and ended up in Seoul, South Korea, where she began her social media career. She was funny and extremely likable in her videos, where she detailed both her past life along with her more current adventures. She was also known to speak out about her previous life and what living in North Korea was like for her. In April of 2017, on her 26th birthday, she wrote on her blog, "This is possibly the happiest birthday of my life. Thank you to all the fans who love me. You give me the courage to keep speaking out." Shortly after this day, Lim disappeared. Her social media accounts stopped seeing their frequent uploads, and at first her friends thought she had just gone on some kind of a shopping trip, but when she didn't return for quite some time, they contacted the authorities. Because of the nature of her escape from North Korea and the fact that she had a large platform where she discussed the issues that the country faced, the missing persons case was considered very serious. 3 months after her disappearance, however, Lim was seen in a video that was posted to a North Korean propaganda site that is run by the government. In the video, she looked incredibly different, and she tearfully explained that she had left South Korea on her own accord, and between this video and the 2 others that were posted, she called herself human garbage and begged for forgiveness from Kim Jong-un. This is obviously all extremely suspicious, and unfortunately Lim has not been heard from since, which has of course left many people wondering what really happened here.
Coming in at number 2, Adriana Murrieta. In November of 2020, Instagram model Adriana Murrieta was reported missing by her family after she had flown to Guadalajara, Mexico. A search of course was quickly started, and it took a few days for the authorities to find anything. Eventually, however, authorities found Adriana, but she had very sadly passed away. The circumstances surrounding her death have been very suspicious from the get-go, and it was clear to authorities that foul play was definitely involved. There has been plenty of review of different surveillance cameras that she was caught on in an attempt to figure out what exactly happened to her, but as far as we know, there haven't been any charges laid in connection to this crime. The last time she was seen was when she was getting into the car that was picking her up from the airport after her flight. She apparently knew the driver of the vehicle, but I'm not sure who this driver was or if they are a suspect. I hope one day we get to hear a conclusion of this story so that her family can receive closure, and because whoever committed this horrible crime most definitely needs to be brought to justice.
In our number 1 spot today, we have Karina Karaglanova. Karina was a Russian travel blogger who had a large Instagram following, where she took her followers along with her on her very lavish adventures. In 2019, Karina's family reported her missing after they were unable to get a hold of her for quite some time. The landlord of Karina was contacted, and the family asked to search her apartment. Eventually, however, they did locate the body of Karina, and it was the worst news that they never expected to receive. Unfortunately, someone had taken her life, and there are some pretty gruesome and horrifying details surrounding that. An investigation was immediately launched to figure out what exactly happened and who did this. While I'm not exactly sure what conclusion this story has, the last updates I was able to find came from 2019, when authorities released very little details about the prime suspect in the case. They never disclosed his identity, but they said he was a 33-year-old acquaintance who had grown jealous after learning Karina planned to go on a holiday with another man. I'm not sure if he ended up being arrested and charged with the crime or not, but I hope one day we get a solid conclusion to this story.
Up first in the number 10 spot is Jim Robinson. A boxer from Miami, Florida in the 1960s, Sweet Jimmy as he was called in the ring, came into the spotlight after he was the 4th person to professionally fight the great Muhammad Ali. On February 7th, 1961, Cassius Clay, who later became Muhammad Ali, was supposed to be fighting a man named Willie Galat, but Galat ended up turning down the offer after finding out he was going to be paid $500 less than his opponent. So down a fighter, the club promoter Chris Dundee, in a last-minute switch around, around recruited Sweet Jimmy instead. Now, the good news for Robinson was that he got his claim to fame that night. However, the bad news was that Ali outweighed him by 16.5 pounds and won by a knockout by a minute 34 into the first round. Through the years, Muhammad and Sweet Jimmy remained good friends though, often seen together around Miami driving around in Ali's pink Cadillac. So you can imagine the shock when out of nowhere, Robinson was gone. After retiring in 1963, Robinson came back into the limelight for a quick stint in '68 before finally calling it quits for good. From there, he laid pretty low and lived a normal life until he was tracked down by Sports Illustrated in 1979 for an interview about his life. Little did his writer know though that this would be the last anyone saw Jim Robinson, as ever since that day his whereabouts have been unknown. Ever since, there have been many attempts and investigations by local police to find him, but sadly none have proven successful. He quite literally vanished without a trace. Next up at number 9 is Ian McIntosh. After rising up to the rank of Lieutenant Commander in the British Royal Navy, during the 60s and 70s, Ian pivoted passions and began turning the adventures of his Navy career into action novels such as A Slaying in September. After his novels were well received by the masses, Ian tried his hand in the TV biz, writing for shows such as the critically acclaimed BBC drama Warship, as well as Thundercloud and The Sandbaggers. Sadly, however, less than a month before his 39th birthday, Ian disappeared and was never to be seen again. On July 7, 1969, while on a trip to Alaska with his partner Susan and friend Graham, who was flying the plane, a distress signal was sent out around 6 p.m. by Barbara. Apparently the plane was approaching the northeast corner of Kodiak Island, and so an air traffic control officer sent off the Coast Guard to help. However, when the military arrived at the plane's last reported location, there was no sign of Ian, his plane, or the rest of his crew. Even stranger was that there was no sign of a crash either. There was no debris, no casualties, and no survivors. And even after searching for days, they never got closer to finding where Ian had vanished off to. They quite simply disappeared, and they, along with their plane, were never seen again. Next up at number 8 is Pierre Bianconi. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Pierre Bianconi was one of the biggest high-level pro soccer players in France. But what made him so famous wasn't a huge amount of goals or a charming personality that people fell in love with. In fact, you could say he was more notorious than famous. Due to his routinely aggressive and unruly behavior, Pierre racked up countless yellow and red penalty cards over the years, and it seemed that he remained unfazed by the increasingly bad facade he was creating for himself. One incident in particular in 1985 earned him great notoriety after he slapped an opposing player and took the red card that was held up to him by the official, ripped it up, and then proceeded to headbutt the referee. Thankfully, the ref only suffered a bloody nose, but Pierre's penalty was a 6-month ban from competitive soccer. But of course, what really made Pierre the most famous of all was when he vanished without a trace in 1993. Very little is known about the events surrounding his disappearance, only that Pierre was last spotted in the port city of Bastia in December of '93, where his car was later found without any trace of its owner. Coming in at number 7 is Jimmy Hoffa. From a very young age, Jimmy was a passionate union activist for America's largest union, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, or IBT. In fact, by his mid-20s, he began being recognized as a fairly important regional figure, and by 52, he was even elected as the vice president. Fast forward a few years to 1957, and Jimmy had worked his way up to be president of the union, a position he held for 14 years. But the thing about Jimmy was that he was not a straight and narrow kind of man. In fact, he was the exact opposite. Despite being a popular figure, it was well known that Jimmy had his hand in some dangerous pies, and was wrapped up in quite a few illegal activities with the mafia. Eventually, these crimes caught up to him, and in '64, Jimmy was convicted for jury tampering and bribery of a grand juror. But it only got worse from there. While on bail during his appeal, Jimmy was convicted in a second trial, this time for conspiracy and mail-in wire fraud. He tried for 4 years to appeal, but when all was said and done, Jimmy was facing a whopping 13 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. In 1967, he went to jail, still working as the president of the Union from the inside, but a mere 4 years into his sentence, President Nixon pardoned him and allowed for his release. However, despite being expected to return back to his union duties, Jimmy strangely disappeared. Last seen at a restaurant parking lot in Detroit, neither Jimmy or his body has ever been recovered. There is some speculation that the mafia could have heard of his release and gotten to him, but we will never really know what happened to Jimmy. Coming in at number 6 is Zahir Rahan. A famous novelist in what was at the time called East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, Zahir rose to international fame in 1971 with his 20-minute documentary entitled Stop Genocide. The documentary was released in the middle of the Bangladesh Liberation War and depicted the plight of refugees fleeing the country's war with Pakistan, shining a light on the harsh military regime that killed roughly 3 million people. Now, as you can probably imagine, despite receiving critical acclaim from other parts of the world, there was one place that was not a fan of his spotlight on the war: Pakistan. And unwittingly, Zahir had put himself in the spotlight of some very powerful people. Then in January of 1972, barely a month after the war had ended and Bangladesh was declared independent, Rahan went missing. The most tragic part of it all is that apparently Rahan was actually out looking for his brother, who he believed was abducted by the Pakistani military 2 days prior, only to vanish himself. Many believe that he was kidnapped along with his brother for supporting Bangladeshi independence, but as there's no evidence, witnesses, or body to be found, no one actually knows what happened to the poor man. Coming in at number 5 is John Brisker. In the early 1970s, John was an all-star player in the ABA and worked his way up the ladder until he found himself in the NBA. By 1972, John was playing for the Seattle Supersonics, but soon his stats began to drop below the usual standard. It seems this downhill trajectory developed into a rather aggressive personality, and John quickly became known as the man you did not want to be on the wrong side of. In fact, during his professional career, he became notorious for needing to be removed from the court. Over the next 2 years, his playtime was limited until sadly he was cut from the team in 1975, and little else is known about what happened after he was cut, except that he and his girlfriend had a daughter in 78. Then, later that year, John decided to switch up his career. After a few failed business ideas, John decided he was going to head over to Africa to start an import-export venture, and so he did. Then on April 11th, 1978, John called his girlfriend from Uganda, but that was the last time he was ever heard from. What happened to John remains a mystery to this day. His remains have never been found, and no one has seen him since he left for Uganda. But the strangest part of it all is that the US State Department could not actually confirm if Brisker had even traveled to Africa in the first place, and have gone on record stating that they believe he is still out there somewhere. Coming in at number 4 is Weldon Keys. Throughout his time in the hot seat, it seemed like Weldon was always on the verge of making it big. He knew all the right people, went to all the right parties, and he worked very consistently as a poet, painter, playwright, pianist, and filmmaker. But for whatever reason, he never seemed to really get his name in lights. His greatest success was The Poet Follies, a musical revue meets burlesque show that premiered in January of 1955, and although Poet Follies earned him great notoriety, his other projects did not find the same kind of support. Then, later that year, the permanent home for the Poet Follies was closed by the fire marshal just days before the premiere of a new one-act play, devastating Weldon to his core. All this effort, with little to no recognition, began to get to Weldon's head, and that paired with his divorce the year prior, slowly but surely began to send him into a deep depression. By early July, his depression was worsening, and he began talking of running off to Mexico to start a new life and never return. However, no one really took this claim that seriously, believing he was just in a bad headspace. But on July 19th of 1955, Weldon disappeared forever. All that was found was a deserted car near the Golden Gate Bridge, his body nowhere in sight. While some assumed he took his own life, the strange part was that his wallet, sleeping bag, and an account savings book with over $800 in it went missing along with him. And the truth of his disappearance remains a mystery to this day. Coming in at number 3, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Author of the famed children's novella The Little Prince, Antoine was not just a writer of fantastical books, but also fancied himself somewhat of a pilot. Although it seems that he may have been better with the typewriter, as he was the victim of not one, but 2 disappearances while flying an aircraft. The first time it happened was in 1935, and Antoine, along with his mechanical engineer on board, crash-landed into the Libyan desert. Despite surviving the crash, the pair had only about 1 day's worth of fluids and very limited food. And by the second day, they both began to experience vivid hallucinations from dehydration. However, after 4 days and on the brink of death, the pair were found by a Bedouin and returned back to safety. Believe it or not, this did not seem to deter Antoine from flying, and in World War II, desperate to do his part for his country, he volunteered his skills as a pilot for the Allies. However, it was quickly discovered he was not quite up to par with the other pilots, often crashing into trees or winding up in the wrong coordinates. Eventually, he became a pretty big liability to the Allies, but still he insisted on doing his part for the greater good. But on his 10th mission in July of 1944, Antoine took off over the Mediterranean and was never seen again. It is debated that his flight may have crashed, but neither him or his body has ever been found, so no one truly knows what happened to him that fateful day. Coming in at number 2 is Barbara Follett. Barbara became a household name when in 1927, at just 12 years old, she published her first novel, The House Without Windows. Lucky for her, her father was the editor of a publishing company, and so with his help, her novel was sent out into the world. Incredibly, the young writer received critically acclaimed reviews from the New York Times, among other companies, and everyone that read her novel agreed that young Barbara was going to be the next great American novelist. And to her credit, she kind of was. 2 years later, she published another novel entitled The Voyage of the Normandy, once again with rave reviews across the board. However, sadly, after the second novel's release, her father abandoned both her and her mother for another woman, leaving them virtually penniless in the midst of the Great Depression. By age 16, she worked as a typist, trying to scrape by like everyone else, until 1931, when she met her soon-to-be husband, Nick Rogers. After a few years of travel, the pair settled down and married in 1934, and although initially happy, by 1937 she was beginning to express her dissatisfaction to close friends, believing that her beloved was being unfaithful. Then on December 9th, 1939, after an argument with her husband, Barbara left the house with $30 to her name, an equivalent of like $500, and was never seen again. But what is especially mysterious is that her husband didn't report her missing for 2 whole weeks. And even then, the media wasn't clued into the disaster until 1966. The mother was famous for believing that the investigation was not thorough enough, but to this day, her body has never been recovered, and police were never able to figure out where Barbara ran away to. Last up in our number 1 spot is Ilenia Carisi. From the moment Ilenia was brought into this world, she was already pretty much famous. Born in 1970 to hugely famous Italian singers Albano and Romina Carisi, it wasn't long before Ilenia joined the family biz and began working as an entertainer herself. By 1984, the young performer made her debut in an Italian film, Champagne in Paradiso, which coincidentally starred both her parents, before later appearing in 1989 as the letter turner for the Italian version of The Wheel of Fortune. However, Ilenia's real dream was to be a writer, so in college she decided to study literature, which, as it turns out, she was really good at. However, as many people in their early 20s do, Ilenia decided to take a break from her studies and travel solo around the world with nothing but a backpack and a journal. She began in South America and worked her way up to Belize, where she stayed for a few months. Then on Boxing Day of 1993, she got on a bus and headed for New Orleans, Louisiana. But tragically, weeks later in January of 94, 23-year-old Ilenia was gone, and no one knew where to find her. She had last been spotted in the haunted French Quarter, and despite the local authorities' great efforts, neither her nor any remains were ever recovered.
Starting off this countdown, we have Bison Dele. Bison Dele, formerly known as Brian Williams, was an NBA player who played center for Orlando Magic, Denver Nuggets, LA Clippers, Chicago Bulls, and Detroit Pistons. In 1997, he won the NBA championships with the Chicago Bulls. He retired early and went around traveling the world and sailing around. In 2002, he headed out on a ship with his girlfriend and older brother. Sadly, none of them would ever make it back. The captain, Deli, and his girlfriend disappeared and were never seen again. 2 weeks later, the boat was found in Tahiti. The only passenger was Deli's brother, Miles, who was dead. He had overdosed on insulin and slipped into a coma. So what happened on that ship? Well, there's no way we could possibly know, but police believe that Miles killed everyone on board, dumped their bodies into the ocean before overdosing. But this has never been confirmed. Moving on to number 9, we have Jim Sullivan. Jim Sullivan was a 35-year-old musician that disappeared on a solo road trip in 1975. He left Los Angeles and planned to go to Nashville in search of more work. It was said that he checked into La Mez Hotel in Santa Rosa, New Mexico, but he never even slept there. The next day, he was spotted at a remote ranch. There, his car was found abandoned, containing money, his guitar, and clothes. He was last seen walking away from the ranch. That's the last time anyone ever saw Jim. Now, a day before he went missing, he called his wife, Barbara, and told her that he was alright. But Barbara was like, okay, yeah, I knew you were fine, so why are you calling? He responded with, "You wouldn't believe if I told you." She then said, "Jim, what's the matter? Is anything wrong?" And he said, "Forget it. Just forget I said anything. I'll call you from Nashville." So that's kind of a weird conversation, especially when the next day he went missing. So what was it that happened to Jim? Now, some believe that Jim was abducted by aliens or managed to make contact with them. I know it sounds crazy, but in 1969 he released an album titled UFO, so people believe maybe he was really into aliens and tried searching for them. Others believe he just wandered off on foot and got lost and then succumbed to the elements. Moving on to number 8, we have Sean Flynn. Sean Flynn was an American actor and photojournalist. He was probably best known for his coverage on the Vietnam War. He grew up following in his dad's, Errol Flynn's, footsteps by becoming an actor, but later changed professions and started working for Time magazine. In April of 1970, Flynn was sent to Cambodia on an assignment for Time magazine. However, while there, he disappeared, never to be heard from again. It's believed that Flynn and his colleague were kidnapped, held captive, and then executed. But no evidence was found showing that they were actually murdered. In March of 2010, remains were discovered and they were believed to belong to Flynn, but upon DNA testing, they discovered that this was not the case, meaning we might never know what really happened to him. In our 7th spot, we have Rico Harris. Rico Harris was a well-known basketball player for the Harlem Globetrotters. Sadly, his dependence on alcohol really got to him and he was forced to stop playing and to get a different job. Sadly, that didn't work out for him either, as he was later fired for drunkenness. After this, in 2014, he planned to live in Seattle with his long-distance girlfriend that lived there. So he had just visited his mom in LA and then headed to go see his girl in Seattle. Sadly, he would never make it. His car was later found abandoned at the side of the road in Sacramento. The car was out of gas and had a nearly dead battery. In his car was his backpack and his phone with a video of him from that night. Harris, however, was nowhere to be found. Now, days after his disappearance, people did say that they saw a giant person walking along State Route 16, which could have been Harris since he was 6'9". So it could be that his car broke down during the drive and he left on foot to go try and find help. But we don't know what happened after that. Moving on to number 6, we have Scott Smith. Scott Smith was a Canadian musician and bassist for the rock band Loverboy. In November of 2000, Smith and some of his friends went on a little sailing trip from Vancouver to Mexico. Sadly, while on his trip, a large wave swept him off of his boat. He was never seen again. Despite a number of searches conducted by US Coast Guards, his body has never been found, which they found to be quite odd. Did a rogue wave really sweep him out to sea? Or did something more sinister happen? We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Joe Pitchler. Joe Pitchler was an American child actor known for being in movies such as Beethoven, The Fan, and Children on Their Birthdays. On January 5th, 2006, he went missing and hasn't been found since. On that day, he made a call to his friend at 4:15 p.m. That was the last time anyone has ever heard from him. On January 9th, his car was found near an intersection. All of his personal belongings were left in his car, except his wallet and car keys. Police found his apartment unlocked and his lights left on, which was very unusual of him. What's frustrating is that there is hardly any evidence in this case. Police really don't know what happened to Joe. Even with search dogs, they couldn't make much sense of his disappearance. So honestly, we probably will never know what happened. Moving on to number 4, we have Lord Lucan. This story is pretty crazy, so just brace yourself. Lord Lucan, or Richard John Bingham, was a very wealthy aristocrat and prominent member of the London social scene, mainly as a gambler. In 1974, he ended up killing his wife Veronica after she divorced him and got custody of the kids. The only problem being, he killed the wrong woman. I know, how could you mess that up? But apparently the room was dark and he thought it was his ex. But no, turns out it was the nanny. Anyways, after this happened, he basically fled to avoid being arrested and charged with murder. And it worked, because he was never found. But rumor has it that he ended up drowning himself from guilt over what he had done, and that his body is at the bottom of the New Haven harbor. In our third spot, we have Michael Rockefeller. Michael Clark Rockefeller was the 5th child of the 41st Vice President of the United States, Nelson Rockefeller. The fact that he was a Rockefeller made his disappearance that more bigger. People were shocked when he disappeared. In 1961, Michael was out boating when his boat overturned, and apparently he swam to shore to look for help. But that's the last we know of what happened to him. But it's believed that he was captured by members of a local tribe that killed and dismembered him. It's incredibly gruesome. Coming in at number 2, we have Harold Holt. Imagine a huge world leader goes missing, like Trump or Biden. That would have the whole country shook. Well, that's what happened to Australia. Harold Holt was the 17th Prime Minister of Australia. In December of 1967, the Prime Minister went out swimming at a deserted beach in Victoria, but he never made it back to shore. Apparently, the weather had been very bad that day. The waves were very high. When Holt went missing, the government felt ashamed. Like, how could they let that happen to their leader? Although his body was never found, in 2005 it was declared he had drowned. But of course, you got a handful of people that don't think this is the case and think something else happened to him. And in our number 1 spot, we have Patrick McDermott. Patrick McDermott is probably best known for being the boyfriend of Grease star Olivia Newton-John. He was also a cameraman, and that's how the two originally met. It was on a set of a commercial he was shooting. Anyways, McDermott disappeared in 2005 after setting off for a fishing trip. He was meant to return the next day, but when he didn't, the US Coast Guards were called in to help. The boat was found with all his personal belongings on it. Ultimately, they concluded that he had fallen off of his boat. But there's a huge belief that he actually faked his own death. He did this in order to avoid the debt he was in. It gets even stranger when apparently a private investigator spotted a man in Mexico matching a very similar description to Patrick. So maybe that's where he's been hiding out for all of these years. But still, this hasn't been confirmed.
Coming in at number 10, we have Taylor Swift. Thank goodness she's back now, but Taylor Swift went into hiding for over a year following a PR disaster that was the first half of 2016. As most of you know, I am Team Taylor all the way, but yeah, the media absolutely crucified the poor girl. Following her breakup with Calvin Harris and the Hiddle Swift drama and Snakegate, she was done. Between the summer of 2016 and the autumn of 2017, she was seldom seen in public. She was hiding her face even when she was. There were even rumours that she was secretly hauled up in London wearing a dark wig in public. Some people even thought that she exited and entered her New York home apartment in a box, which is a bit ridiculous, but maybe. Some fans were totally livid when a screen was erected to hide her from public view at her friend Abigail's wedding. Luckily, she stormed back onto the scene with her 2017 album Reputation, which addressed a lot of the reasons she went missing. From Taylor Swift to Susan Boyle, it's a natural transition at number 9. While it took Taylor a good 10 years in the public eye to finally snap, Susan Boyle, the unlikely success story of Britain's Got Talent in 2009, shot to fame and could not handle it. Susan has Asperger's syndrome, which made dealing with the spotlight a lot more challenging for her. After the finals of Britain's Got Talent, Boyle hid out in her home in Blackburn to avoid media attention. These days she still struggles to deal with it, and although she does step out to promote her music and tour occasionally, when she isn't performing she lives a very private life. Coming into number 8, we have comedian Dave Chappelle. While the award-winning comedian is back in the spotlight these days, Dave Chappelle took an 8-year hiatus with sporadic performances in between. Up until 2006, Chappelle was riding a wave of success. Esquire even called him the comic genius of America. He'd won several awards, he had his own documentary and a $50 million contract with Comedy Central. Despite all of that, Chappelle walked away from it all to live on a ranch in Ohio with his wife and family. However, in 2013, he dipped his toe back in the full-time waters, and these days, he's pretty firmly back in the spotlight. Next up, we have a famous 60s sex icon who caused a scandal that shook Britain, leading her to quit the spotlight and go into hiding age 22. Of course, at number 7, we have Christine Keeler. Christine Keeler was at the center of the Profumo affair. The affair was such a scandal because Keeler slept with both a Russian naval officer and John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War in England. Obviously, a beautiful young socialite canoodling with a high-ranking English and Russian officer during the Cold War was a big cause for concern. This eventually led to her being crucified by the public and even sent to jail for 9 months for perjury. When she was released, she had 2 short-lived marriages, following which she pretty much became a recluse. Coming in at number 6, we have Greta Garbo. 3-time Academy Award nominated actress Greta Garbo absolutely hated the spotlight from the start. This caused friction between her and the studio. Despite being a darling of the screen in the mid-1920s and 30s, she snubbed awards ceremonies and social functions. She decided to retire from acting in the 1940s and preferred to live a life of solitude. She reportedly said to a friend, "I was tired of Hollywood. I did not like my work. There were many days when I had to force myself to go to the studio. I really wanted to live another life." Coming into number 5, we have Jennifer Hudson. Poor Jennifer Hudson had such a devastating ordeal to contend with. She'd already risen to fame by the time it made international news when her mother, brother and nephew were shot dead in their home in Chicago. Hudson then went into hiding for months to try and cope with her ordeal. She said that her faith helped her through the dark times. Now eventually, when she was ready to emerge from hiding, she secured an opening performance to the 2009 Super Bowl. Coming in at number 4, we have Agnetha Fältskog. ABBA were huge news in the 1970s and early 80s, making it from a small Swedish band to becoming an international super band. This all happened after they won the Eurovision Song Contest in 1974. Agnetha and band member Bjorn Ulvaeus had a relationship and eventually got married and had children. The pair split and Bjorn wrote "The Winner Takes It All." When the band finally split in 1982, Agnetha tried to go it alone, but from 1988 she took a 17-year hiatus. She moved back to Sweden, but she went to the isolated area of Eckerö. Coming into number 3, we have Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson's mental struggles are a much discussed topic. The king of pop found fame as a child and then went it alone in 1970. Now, he reached the pinnacle of his success in the early 80s with Thriller. Jackson's mental state started to decline significantly towards the end of the 90s, and by the turn of the millennia, he was plagued with child sex abuse allegations. This led to Jackson gradually retiring from public life and even having to close his personal sanctuary and hideout, Neverland. Jackson became more and more reclusive until money troubles forced his hand into a comeback, but unfortunately that wasn't to be either. Another star who had a meltdown and subsequently went into hiding for a while, we have Britney Spears at number 2. Britney became famous at a young age, and it's a tale as old as time really. She struggled to deal with it. Following her time in the Mickey Mouse Club, the Baby One More Time singer had become a huge international success before the age of 20. After a breakup with NSYNC frontman Justin Timberlake, Britney started going off the rails a bit. In 2007, she'd shaved her head and had a full-on meltdown. Spears then spent around 5 months in hiding after checking herself into rehab. Arguably, she needed a bit more time to heal, but these days she is back in the spotlight and seems more stable. Okay, a very controversial one at number 1, but if it's true, it will be the biggest and best celebrity hideout conspiracy of all time. We have Elvis. The king of rock reportedly died in 1977 after dropping dead on the toilet. The star had suffered some kind of drugs-related health issues and his weight had soared. However, a lot of people think that the star simply burned out and faked his death so that he could retire from public life. Indeed, since his death, there have been strings of Elvis sightings over the years, especially John Burroughs Gate. If Elvis is alive now, he would be in his 80s and would have successfully managed to evade public life for 40 years.
Starting us off at number 10 is Connie Converse. Born Elizabeth Converse and raised in the Baptist Church, in the early 1950s, Elizabeth moved to New York, started calling herself Connie, and began writing songs and performing performing them for her friends, accompanying herself on the guitar. Didn't take long before Connie began assimilating into her new lifestyle, smoking and drinking for the first time in her life. Now, to be clear, she had no recorded issues, but her parents, still deeply religious, saw this as an act of defiance and essentially rejected her new life entirely and refused to support Connie's music career. Sadly, her parents were not alone in this rejection. Besides one brief TV appearance on the morning show, Connie's singer-songwriter approach to music was not widely popular, nor did she ever really receive much positive recognition. It seems her lyrical, melancholy ballads got lost in the brass, and by 1961, convinced she was a failure with no real talent, Connie quit music altogether. Then in 1974, just after her 50th birthday, Connie wrote letters to her friends and family, essentially stating that she wished to make a new life for herself, and instead of going to the lake for a family gathering where she had been expected, Connie drove away and was never seen or heard from again. There are some theories that she could have taken her own life, but no body was ever found. Although now, some 49 years later, it is likely she could be gone at this point. However, one can only hope she was alive to see when her music became a cult classic in 2009 after being released by Gene Deitch's record label. Next up at number 9 is Forrest Shab, a Vancouver rapper who came into the spotlight back in 2009 after releasing his hit club track Passenger. Forrest began touring Canada as the opener for Akon after signing a deal with CP Records. Now, Forrest performed under the stage name DY, which stood for Die Young, and aside from being an extremely ominous name for someone who disappeared at the young age of 26, was, as far as anyone else could see, doing really well for himself. So I guess that's what kind of makes him especially mysterious. Unlike some of the others on this list, his life and career were actually on a really good trajectory. He was even preparing to drop his second single at the time of his disappearance. But after announcing his upcoming full-length album in 2010, Forrest apparently shot the music video for his second single, and allegedly at that time his contract with CP Records ended. Then in August of 2010, Forrest flew from Toronto to Mexico. A few weeks later, he wished his friend a happy birthday over social media, but sadly that was the last anyone heard from him. By November 18th, he was reported missing in Mexico, and Canadian police began investigating his whereabouts. In December, his family released grave worry about his disappearance, and although some have speculated his disappearance is related to organized crime affiliations or potentially even that he took his own life due to the loss of his contract, it all remains a complete speculation. 12 years have passed and he still remains a missing person with no viable leads about where he could be. Next up at number 8, Oscar Zeta Acosta, a writer, attorney, and activist for the Chicano movement of the United States in the 40s and 50s. Acosta was well known as being a big-time consumer of pills, booze, and hallucinogens in extreme quantities. Not only that, he was a close friend with writer Hunter S. Thompson, who wrote about and immortalized Acosta as the drug-hazed Dr. Gonzo in his novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. But sadly, although the book brought Thompson great fame, it also brought a great deal of tension to their relationship that never fully mended while Acosta was in the limelight. Acosta was a well-known public figure with a reputation for disruption, so it perplexed everyone when in May of 1974 he visited his family home in Mexico and simply vanished out of thin air. Thompson spent years searching for his friend with no success, and along with Acosta's son, feared that perhaps his friend had been killed by a drug hit or assassination. However, as no information has ever surfaced, his whereabouts remain a giant mystery to this day. Next up at number 7 is Dan Cooper. Okay, so this man was less of a celebrity before his disappearance, but he became one due to it happening. Back in 1971, a man who went by the alias Dan Cooper hijacked a commercial plane, and no one has ever been able to find him since. According to those involved, shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a bomb in his briefcase. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills, which is about the equivalent of like $1.2 million nowadays. Otherwise, he was going to kill everyone on the plane. After the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper released the 36 passengers once authorities provided him with the money and parachutes. But he kept both pilots, one flight engineer, and flight attendants as hostages on the plane. From there, he forced them to fly to Mexico City, but somewhere over Nevada, Cooper jumped off the plane with the stolen cash. The FBI launched a massive search that is still considered one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in FBI history. But he has yet to be found, and although he isn't on the top 10 wanted list anymore, he is still considered a missing and wanted person. Coming in at number 6, Rico Harris. In 2000, Rico Harris was a player for the Harlem Globetrotters, but despite his clear talent and incredible potential, Rico suffered from alcoholism and slowly but surely began to lose all his athletic opportunities. After losing his position as a professional player, Rico spent the next few years battling his addiction until finally a 2007 overdose led him to a rehabilitation center. After completing the program, Rico wound up working as a security guard in LA, met a woman, and was beginning to really find his stride. The couple were long distance at first, but by 2014, 2 years after they met, things were going really well, so Harris decided to make the move to Washington from California and set up a job interview in his new city. Before the big move, he went to say goodbye to his family in Alabama to get some closure, specifically from his mother, according to his girlfriend at the time. But after leaving his mother's house in Alabama, records show that he drove north, stopping in Lottie, about 40 miles south of Sacramento, to get gas before calling his girlfriend and leaving a message saying that he was going up the mountains to rest since he had not slept much since leaving Seattle. Then, mysteriously, at 11:15 p.m., he turned off his phone, and not a single soul has heard from him or seen him since that day. His car was found abandoned outside Sacramento, and an investigation into his disappearance uncovered a backpack and a phone on the roadside. At the same time, there had been a few reports of a tall man walking along Route 16, and human footprints were found in the sand. But never any sign of Harris himself. Coming in at number 5 is Joe Pitchler. During the late 90s and early 2000s, Joe was a teen actor who received some success appearing in small and supporting roles in several movies and TV shows over the years, like Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, Varsity Blues, and was Brennan Newton in the Beethoven franchise. After his small bit of LA success, his family insisted he move back to Washington so that he could graduate high school there. Joe agreed and graduated high school in Washington in 2005, and according to friends and family, he planned to return to LA in 2006 after his braces were removed to continue pursuing his acting career. But strangely, on January 5th, 2006, after speaking with a friend at about 4 a.m., he was never seen or heard from again. On January 9th, his car was found abandoned and his apartment was left untouched, unlocked, and with all the lights on. And apart from one note that vaguely spoke to a depressed state, there was nothing pointing towards Joe taking his own life. In fact, the friend he'd spoken with on January 5th mentioned he seemed in really good spirits. Tragically, the case has never been solved, and no remains have ever been found, and so 17 years later, Joe remains a missing person, and his whereabouts remain just as big a mystery today as they were then. Coming in at number 4 is Patrick McDermott. Although Patrick worked as a fairly successful cinematographer on a handful of short films in the 2000s, his main claim to fame came from his personal life. Famously, Patrick was the on-again, off-again partner of pop star Olivia Newton-John for 9 years between 1996 to 2005. And at the time of his disappearance in 2005, Patrick was on board a Mexico-bound fishing boat, which was apparently somewhat of a frequent activity for him. But this this time, he never returned. He boarded all alone, and despite some of his personal belongings, including his car keys, passport, and wallet, which were all found on the boat, Patrick was never seen again. What's especially strange is that according to the Coast Guard, there was no sign of accident, criminal activity, or an attempt to take his own life while on board. The most accepted theory of his whereabouts, after a PI was hired to look into the case for Dateline, is that Patrick faked his own death to avoid substantial debts and allow his son to cash in on his life insurance policy. There are even some conspiracies that he remains hiding out in Mexico to this day with a new girlfriend, but officially there is no concrete evidence that this is true. In fact, one of the photos that was used in an Australian tabloid claiming to be Patrick turned out to be a random guy from Manitoba, Canada with his wife, leaving us no closer to the truth behind this strange disappearance. Next up at number 3 is Hale Boggs. In 1972, Hale Boggs was one of the most famous politicians in America. A Democrat from New Orleans, Boggs became well known by the public for not only being the House Majority Leader during the Nixon years, but also, or even more so, for his frequent, colorful outbursts while on the job. He famously verbally attacked FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, as well as the FBI as a whole in Congress, became a member who President Nixon refused to take counsel from, and became notorious after outwardly doubting the lone gunman theory of the JFK shooting. Now, Hale was unfortunately someone who suffered from addiction, and it became kind of the belief that most of what he was saying had more to do with his issue with drugs and alcohol than anything else. So imagine the nation's shock when on October 16th of 1972, Boggs, who had been in Alaska helping a fellow congressman's re-election bid, disappeared and was never seen or heard from again. All that was known was that the pair got into an aircraft heading towards the small town of Juneau, Alaska. But despite there being a law that the aircraft needed to be equipped with an emergency locator transmitter, this aircraft was mysteriously not equipped with one. Naturally, the US government instigated a massive search, launching 90 planes to search the area, but no trace of the missing aircraft or its occupants were ever recovered. There are some conspiracies surrounding his death, particularly due to his issues with the FBI and work investigating the JFK case, and some believe he was assassinated. But the truth is that no one really knows what happened to him or where he could have gone. Coming in our number 2 spot is Sean Flynn. Growing up, both Sean's dad and mom were successful actors, and so most of his life Sean assumed he would follow in their footsteps. So after attending Duke University in 1960, Sean embarked on his career and tried to recreate their success. However, after making 10 movies, 8 of which completely bombed, Sean decided that acting was not what he wanted out of life, and in the mid-1960s retired from being in front of the camera and decided to get behind one instead. Sean found his calling as a photojournalist and ended up flying out to Vietnam during the war, working as a freelancer first for a French magazine, Paris Match, followed by Time Life, and finally working for United Press International. During his time as a photojournalist, Sean made quite the name for himself, capturing some harrowing moments of the country's time at war. But unfortunately, it would also lead to his disappearance. In April of 1970, Sean, along with some other journalists, made his way over to Phnom Penh to attend a government-sponsored conference. However, unlike the others, Sean and one other member decided to ride their motorcycles instead of taking the limousine provided. All that is known is that Sean stopped at a location where the Viet Cong was known to be using, and he was never seen again. While there are many theories that he was taken out by the Khmer Rouge, his remains have never been found, and despite extensive searches to find him, no one has been able to uncover what really happened to Sean while visiting the dangerous checkpoint. And last up in our number 1 spot, Zelim Bakev. Starting in 2013, Zelim began quickly rising to fame after releasing several singles. While climbing the ladder, the Russian pop star applied to be a part of the 10th season of the Russian version of the popular reality show Star Academy. Zaleem was accepted and slated to begin in 2017, but tragically he never made it. On August 6, 2017, Zaleem was traveling to a nearby town to attend his sister's wedding before making his way back to Moscow to begin shooting. But allegedly, on August 8th, he was arrested by Chechen authorities exactly the same day his phone became inexplicably deactivated. By August 18th, no one had heard from him, and his mother, extremely worried about his whereabouts, filed a complaint with her local police about her son's disappearance. Now, the scary part about all of this is that there's a lot of speculation that he was kidnapped and arrested for being gay. Something that is plausible considering the anti-LGBTQ campaign that was going on at the time of his disappearance. And no matter how hard his mom tried, the government refused to open a criminal investigation into his disappearance, but was simply told he would reappear soon. Then in September of 2017, an eerie YouTube video was posted by someone claiming to be Zaleem, saying that he lives in Germany now, but his family doesn't believe it's him. While no one knows exactly what happened to the poor young man, there are a lot of theories that he was either killed or that he remains trapped somewhere by the government.